Good evening and welcome to ET Now Startup Central, India's first and only daily show dedicated to startups, technology and entrepreneurship. Some very important flashes breaking on your screen right now. The telecom regulator TRAI has just issued recommendations with respect to a data protection framework. We must remember here that the overarching data protection law that's supposed to come under Justice Sri Krishna Committee is still pending. It was supposed to come out a few weeks back, but there have been some delays. It's expected to be released anytime this month or next month. Meanwhile, the TRAI has issued its own norms with respect to security and ownership of telecom data. We're just playing some of those flashes on the screen. So they have issued recommendations on security, on ownership of telecom data. They've also said that companies collecting, processing user data do not have any rights over it, and that the entities should not use metadata to identify users. Metadata is basically data that gives you information about other data. So they have clearly said that you should not use metadata to identify users. They've spoken about how the existing data protection framework is inadequate and that they have favored users' right to be forgotten by telecom companies. They've also said that companies in the digital ecosystem must disclose data breach to users whenever it happens. Now, these are important recommendations coming from the TRAI. Issues such as right to be forgotten is something that has been incorporated in Europe's GDPR, which is seen as the gold standard as far as data protection rules are concerned. We do not know what kind of norms the India's data protection framework is going to have, whether it will have hefty penalties for companies who flout data norms, who flout data privacy of users. Those are some details that we will get in the coming weeks. But these are TRAI's own recommendations as far as telecom is concerned. Remember, the RBI had come out with a set of recommendations in terms of storage of data locally. So I guess different regulators are coming up with different framework. It really remains to be seen how all this will be incorporated into the overarching data protection law for India. For more perspective, we are joined by Nikhil Kumar of iSpirit, who is joining us on the phone line. Nikhil, thank you so much for taking out time and joining us on Startup Central. You know, you heard out some of those key points from TRAI as far as the data protection framework is concerned. This is what the telecom regulator wants. But, how is this going to work out? The TRAI has issued a set of norms. RBI is issuing a different set of norms. What should the Justice Sri Krishna Committee already do, or have they already taken into account suggestions from different regulators when it comes to data protection?
Thank you so much, Chandra. I think this is an extremely good welcome move and a very timely move, because what is important for us to understand is that telecom companies probably today have the most amount of information about a user. It starts with KYC information about you, which has your personal identifiable data. And it almost has every single call transaction, every call and every SMS that has been sent around as a part of your data, and also all the websites, etc., that you visited. So the kind of information that telecom companies has, and for a long time there hasn't been clarity on how this protection, etc., will work, and that's what TRAI is very clearly called out, saying that the current data protection architecture which exists for telecom companies is not adequate enough. Apart from having telecom data, due to the channels that we use for our information about financial services, telecom companies actually also sit on the transaction data that you receive from your bank in the form of SMS, etc. So it's very important to regulate the use of this data, because one could be using this data for various different purposes. And I think TRAI bringing this framework is more from a regulator and an industry operating guideline, whereas in the case of a conflict, when somebody does something wrong, etc., I think that's when the Justice Sri Krishna Committee's data protection law will come in. So think about the law as an overarching guideline for both consumers, regulator, telcos, and everybody else to comply. But the TRAI regulation is very similar to many other regulating guidelines for telcos, and which will be very sector specific. Uh, Similarly, it should be noted so that RBI is not just spoken about the localization. RBI has also announced a new entity called the NBFC Account Aggregator, and they're going to implement the consent architecture, which will basically mean that even in the banking system, the banks are nothing but custodians of your data. And if you as a user have to share this data or get this data, or even if the bank has to use your data, they have to do with meaningful consent. So I think we are moving towards this in different segments. I'm very glad to see that TRAI taking this step forward. They have been doing, as you might recall, they have been doing consultations around data protection in telecom. They had hosted a paper and then asked for feedback. I think these regulations are a good welcome move. And
Right.
basically enabling a consented data flow will enable a number of different use cases for users to use. For example, think about you seeing all your Airtel SMS and bills very well organized in an app of your choice and not anymore on the Airtel's app. So I expect this to enable a
Right.
new way of telecom
Right.
experience for consumers on software.
Right, but Nikhil, there's going to be so much of overlap. What will TRAI ultimately have jurisdiction on? Because your phone is now your bank. It's now become the place where you do shopping, where you do banking, where you do a range of transactions. So, isn't there going to be an overlap here between various regulators? And where will Justice Sri Krishna Committee come in? You mentioned that they will perhaps come in when there has been a violation in terms of penalty. But how are all these agencies going to work together when there's been a breach that perhaps covers 2 or 3 more regulators? For example, if there's been a data breach from a bank or a financial transaction on a mobile phone, who's accountable here? Whose rules will apply?
I think it needs to be seen, but I guess the way this would work is that the overarching data protection law will give a framework for regulators to form their own regulations in each of these segments. For example, let's take healthcare as a separate vertical. So whether RBI and TRAI actually won't cover what needs to be done in healthcare. So that is why we need the overarching data protection law. And we're all waiting to see what exactly is in the Justice Sri Krishna Committee recommendation. And as far as my guess goes, that it's going to be a cross-segment, cross-vertical, overarching data protection law. And they might, in that say that each regulator has to come up with his own rules and regulations for the industry that they regulate.
Right. Nikhil, hold your thoughts there. We also have Pranesh Prakash, someone who you know very well, who was previously with the Center for Internet and Society, someone who knows, anything about data protection really well. Pranesh, thank you for joining us on Startup Central. You went through the key points issued by the TRAI. They've said that companies cannot have control over the data they are processing. They must not use metadata to identify users. There needs to be a right to be forgotten clause as far as the data they are processing is concerned. How do you read all these developments? Will this be incorporated in the data protection law that Justice Sri Krishna is scripting?
Very frankly, I don't know what to make of it yet. I'm still processing it. I haven't had a chance to read all the recommendations yet. It's a lengthy document, but on the face of it, it seems good. But there still are certain concerns that I have which haven't been addressed. For instance, while there are welcome provisions discussing privacy, discussing the need for encryption, and how telecom operators shouldn't be collecting more than what is necessary, the existing telecom licenses themselves, which are issued by the government of India, require a whole lot of data to be collected, metadata to be collected by telecom companies. So I'm not sure how that requirement by the government of India squares off with what is being recommended right now by TRAI, which has all kinds of positive things such as data minimization, privacy by design, and other such best practices. from the EU especially.
Right. Pranesh, in fact, I was just coming to that. Just a couple of days back, the Supreme Court pulled up the government on its plans to create a surveillance state, so to speak, in terms of screening WhatsApp messages. So on the one hand, you have the Supreme Court pulling up the government for being a surveillance state. On the other hand, you have the telecom regulator, telling the private sector how they need to safeguard user privacy. What do you make of the dichotomy here? One rule for the government, one rule for the private sector.
Well, this recommendation by TRAI, and let's remember that this is actually not regulation itself. This is just a recommendation. Would in fact affect the government, not just the private sector, because if the private sector is restricted in terms of what it, not just how it uses data, but also what data it collects, then government access to that data will also get restricted. And there, as far as I can see from at least the top level points, again, let me confess that I haven't read the full recommendations yet. They're quite lengthy. At least from what I can see from the summary, they haven't actually addressed this issue. Now, I must, despite all of this, say that it looks very good. This is a kind of framework that privacy enthusiasts have been asking for, that those who have been fighting for civil liberties would probably welcome. But there's still a lot of gray and lots of space in this analysis. Let me also point out that one of the things that TRAI says, where it might be exceeding its brief a bit, is that it says that this should not only cover telecom operators, but should also cover device manufacturers, operating systems, application creators, and other kinds of software. So it's what TRAI seems to want to do is actually quite a bit more than what I think the DOT has or really ought to be doing. So I really don't understand how. Whether this will actually find any favor in the interim before the government decides to take up the Justice Sri Krishna report.
Right. In fact, Pranesh, that's an interesting point. They've used a very vague sentence called, digital ecosystem. But digital ecosystem, as you said, it's not just telecom. It could include the VoIP messengers. It could include social media. It could include e-commerce sites, pretty much any company in the business of digital. But I have a third guest. I believe one of your former colleagues from the Center for Internet and Society, Amber Sinha, also joins us on Startup Central. Amber, you've gone through the points. The story just broke, so I don't expect you to go through the entire document. On the face of it, very positive recommendations coming from TRAI. It says, users have a right to be forgotten. There shouldn't be metadata used to identify users, that they do not have rights over the data they are processing. What do you make of these, and how is this going to be implemented when we have the data protection framework by Justice Sri Krishna in the coming weeks?
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are audible. Please go on.
A couple of points right at the outset. Much like I think Pranesh mentioned earlier, that in terms of the mandates that different government bodies have at this point, it's not entirely clear exactly what the role of each of the sectoral regulators is going to be, especially when the Sri Krishna Committee under MeitY is supposedly drafting an omnibus data protection law that will apply across all sectors and hopefully to both public and private bodies. So at this point, it's not just TRAI, but also the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare and RBI, which have which have engaged in either in some form of regulations which have to do with data protection, or in other cases, they've circulated drafts for comments which touch upon privacy and security issues. So in that sense, the specific role that each of the regulators will have will only emerge with time once we have an omnibus law, and then we will have sectoral regulations which will, I presume, complement that. So in that sense, what one would hope is that the different government entities are communicating with each other, and there is some consensus in terms of broad privacy principles on the basis of which they are looking to frame regulations. That is one thing that one would hope is being done at this point. Apart from that, like you mentioned, the regulations have just come out, and I've only looked at the broad recommendations, which have been just a couple of quick points that I can make on the top of it. One is the right to be forgotten has been endorsed in this document. What will be interesting to see is in what form we want to see right to be forgotten. One point that I would like to make is that we don't really have right to be forgotten in most jurisdictions. Even in the EU GDPR, what we have is a limited right to erasure. So right to be forgotten in privacy jurisprudence remains a very contested right. And in what form, when we are looking at a form of that in our law, we have to be cautious about how it is implemented. The other point that I would make is with regard to the development of an electronic consent framework by MeitY that it recommends, on the lines of the account aggregator regulations that the RBI has already released. Now, that's also going to be interesting in terms of what sort of aggregators does TRAI envision in the telecom sector and what role they would play. So those are, I think, two things that I would be very keen to see how they develop in light of these recommendations.
Right. Amber, but will this cause confusion to a certain extent? I mean, RBI has come out, with its own set of regulations, particularly with respect to localization of data storage. TRAI has come out with its own set of norms. I mean, should the different regulators have just waited for, the Justice Sri Krishna report? Then you have an overarching framework, and then you know exactly, what each regulator is going to do. Because there is so much of overlap between, what an RBI does, what a TRAI does, with banking going mobile and UPI and all of that. So does this create scope for confusion to a certain extent in terms of the jurisdiction of each regulator, or, should we wait for the Justice Sri Krishna committee to really clarify on that?
At this stage, I wouldn't say that it creates confusion because, much like Pranesh said, these are only recommendations, and I think there is still some way to go before they're translated into actual regulations. Similarly, other set of regulations, for instance, which the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare has come out with, is also in the form of draft consultation legislation document. So at this point, they're still either in a recommendatory form or they are at a consultation form. But if you get to a point where these turn into regulations without an omnibus data protection legislation coming into effect, at that point it will be a cause for concern, because ideally what we require at this point is a robust omnibus data protection law that applies across sectors, as opposed to piecemeal sectoral regulations coming up only from specific sectoral bodies.
Right. Pranesh, I want to, bring it back to you. Amber, hold your thoughts for a minute. I just want to take this to Pranesh. Pranesh, whatever RBI has said, whatever TRAI has said, it doesn't cover Aadhaar, which has sort of become fundamental to any transaction that you do today, even when you're onboarded as a customer on telecom networks. Will the UIDAI then have the mandate over, the Aadhaar part of data protection? How is that going to work? Because the sense we got from the Sri Krishna committee is that there will definitely be a section dedicated to what happens to Aadhaar in terms of how that fits into the data protection framework. But would you have expected the TRAI to also sort of mention this?
Not really. I wasn't expecting it. And let's remember, with regard to data ownership and security, which are two of the main components of this, already with regard to Aadhaar, there are separate regulations issued by UIDAI and by MAITI. So that, to an extent, has been covered. So things like, the kind of encryption that needs to be done. Now, in this report, they talk about the need for encryption. Now, things like that are already covered with regard to Aadhaar by other agencies. So I wasn't really expecting it. What TRAI could have done is encourage DOT not to use Aadhaar for the time being, and not to make it mandatory. But that kind of a recommendation has not been forthcoming as far as I have read of this. But I must also add that there are some very, very welcome recommendations here with regard to encryption. In the kind of encryption paradigm that we have in the telecom licenses is from the late 80s, if not the early 90s. And they've actually, for the first time, as far as I know, recommended that they be updated. Now, even in previous consultations about telecom licenses, this is an area that TRAI has not gone into. But finally, they have provided a recommendation on this to DOT. And if this recommendation is taken on board, that would mean that telecom security in India will definitely increase. Right now, there's a mismatch between what the license allows, which is very, very weak security, almost no security, and what things like, regular telecom functions require.
Right, Pranesh.
And so, all in all, these are very welcome recommendations, even if the implications of it aren't all too clear.
All right. On that note, thank you so much, Pranesh, Amber, and Nikhil, for putting it all in perspective, for joining us on our coverage of this breaking story. Nandan Nilekani likes to say that India's a data-rich country before it becomes economically rich, but it remains to be seen how we are going to safeguard all that data generated every second, thanks to the jump in mobile usage and data usage we've seen in the last few years. But on the face of it, very welcome recommendations by TRAI. But the details, of course, lie in the execution, and maybe we will have a framework once we have the data protection law in India. But on that note, completely out of time, and thank you so much for joining us on this special edition of Startup Central.